In the sprawling depths of the universe, where alien civilizations thrived and waged wars, there was a sense of superiority that extended across many species. Humans? They were considered lowly, primitive even, a minor nuisance in the grand cosmic scale. For the alien trader Zorak, capturing one of them was a simple matter. He boasted about it often, laughing in his gravelly tone to his fellow merchants, describing how he'd snatched the human from Earth, a planet barely worth noticing. To Zorak, this human was just another piece of cargo, destined to be sold or used as cheap labor. Nothing more, nothing less. It amused him that so many species feared humans, but in Zorak's mind, they were weak, easily breakable. "Look at him," Zorak would say to his peers, gesturing to the human chain behind him. "So fragile. Took barely any effort at all to bring him here." His alien friends would laugh, reveling in their perceived power over a species they deemed insignificant. But not everyone shared Zorak's arrogance. In the corner of the bustling alien market, an old voice cut through the laughter. It was Gravik, an elder of a race long thought wise beyond the stars, but now fading into obscurity. Gravik had lived through the Great War, a conflict most had long forgotten. But he had not. He had seen what humans could do. "You've made a grave mistake, Zorak," Gravik said, his voice roughened by age and memories of battles past. "A human slave? Do you even know what you've brought into your hands?" Zorak chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "It's just a human, Gravik. Don't tell me you're one of those old fools who still fears them?" Gravik didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You should. Humans aren't like the others. They don't break. Not like you think. Not in the way you expect." Zorak, ever the egotist, wasn't convinced. He leaned in, mocking. "Oh, come on. This one? He hasn't even said a word since we captured him. He's obedient. Nothing more than an animal waiting for its next order." But Gravik wasn't done. "You see a quiet slave. I see a storm brewing. You don't understand. They're different. They don't give up. That quietness? That's not submission, Zorak. That's patience." The human, shackled and silent, stood there, observing. He didn't react to the insults or the boasting. His eyes, however, told a different story. Beneath the surface was something brewing, something Zorak couldn't comprehend, but Gravik had seen before. Zorak may have captured the body, but he didn't understand the fire that burned within every human, especially when they were wronged. Zorak, with his foolish pride, ignored the elder's warning, eager to show off his new acquisition. He yanked the chain connected to the human's wrists, and dragged him toward the crowd, lifting the human's chin as if showing off a rare prize. "See? Perfectly tame." But Gravik's words didn't leave Zorak's mind as easily as he hoped. Even as the day went on and the alien market continued bustling with trade and noise, Zorak couldn't shake the elder's warning. It gnawed at him in the quiet moments, though he would never admit it. To him, there was no threat. He had the power. He had control. The human, meanwhile, remained silent, obedient even, doing what was required, offering no resistance. He was taken to Zorak's ship, where other slaves of various species were also held in cramped, dark quarters. To the untrained eye, he blended in with the rest of the defeated. But the truth was, the human was far from broken. Every step, every moment of silence, was part of his plan. His mind was constantly at work, analyzing, calculating, waiting for the right moment. He understood that in this alien world, being underestimated was his greatest advantage. He saw the fear in the other captives' eyes, but more importantly, he saw the systems of control, where the weaknesses lay, how the guards operated, and how the other prisoners interacted with each other. For days he said nothing. He did nothing to draw attention. But all the while, he was gathering information, observing the patterns, noting who was sympathetic, who could be trusted, and which of the guards were sloppy in their duties. It was all preparation for what was to come. Zorak, content in his belief that the human was no threat, allowed the days to pass without incident. He continued his routine, oblivious to the fact that the foundation of his control was slowly being eroded from within. What Zorak saw as obedience was simply the calm before the storm. Time passed, but the human remained quiet, blending into the shadows of Zorak's ship, just as he intended. The other captives barely noticed him at first, many of them too consumed by their own despair. Yet there was something in his demeanor that stood out, something that the others couldn't quite put their finger on. Where they had given up, this human's eyes were sharp, always watching, always planning. He had no need for words. His actions, small as they were, would soon speak louder. The first signs of resistance were subtle, so subtle that Zorak and his crew missed them entirely. A tool here, a missing part there, nothing big enough to arouse suspicion, but enough to start causing minor delays. The ship's mechanics would occasionally fail, small glitches and inconveniences that the crew dismissed as routine maintenance problems. But these issues were far from accidental. The human had begun his silent war, knowing full well that direct confrontation would be foolish. Instead, he attacked where they wouldn't think to look, their overconfidence. With every small act of sabotage, he learned more about the ship, its systems, and its weaknesses. He found the patterns in the guards' shifts, memorized the codes they used for the locks, and identified which prisoners could be trusted. Some of the captives began to notice his actions, and whispers started circulating among them. They didn't speak directly to him, but they watched. They understood that something was happening, though they couldn't yet grasp the full scale of what the human was orchestrating. Zorak, of course, remained blissfully unaware, too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the cracks forming beneath his feet. As far as he was concerned, his operation was running smoothly. The human? Still just another slave, doing as he was told. Zorak had no reason to believe otherwise. After all, humans were weak, weren't they? Easily dominated, easily controlled. But within the confines of the ship, the human was gathering allies. It started with a few quiet conversations, a nod here, a glance there. The other captives began to see him not as another broken soul, but as someone who had a plan, someone who could lead them out of the darkness. Some were skeptical at first, too beaten down by their own experiences to believe in the possibility of escape. Others, however, saw the glimmer of hope the human offered and began to quietly spread the word. As more captives joined the cause, the human's strategy became clearer. He wasn't just sabotaging for the sake of it. Every act was deliberate, carefully planned to build towards something bigger. The disruptions became more frequent, more calculated. Power flickered at odd intervals, security systems experienced random glitches, and the guards started noticing missing items, small things that, in isolation, seemed insignificant but together painted a picture of something much more dangerous. The human knew that time was his ally. Zorak's overconfidence would be his undoing, but only if the human remained patient. He continued his careful sabotage, waiting for the right moment to strike. And while he waited, he forged stronger bonds with the other captives. They weren't just fellow prisoners anymore, they were comrades, part of a growing underground resistance that was slowly eroding Zorak's control. Among the prisoners, there was an unspoken understanding: the human was their leader now. Even without words, his actions conveyed a sense of purpose that gave them all hope. He didn't need to rally them with speeches or promises of freedom. His quiet, methodical approach was enough. They knew that when the time came, they would follow him without question. Zorak, for his part, remained oblivious, though his patience was beginning to wear thin. The minor issues on his ship were starting to irritate him. He blamed his crew for their incompetence, never once suspecting that the real culprit was right under his nose. As far as he was concerned, the human was still nothing more than a slave, a piece of property that posed no real threat. But the human was far from harmless. He had already planted the seeds of rebellion, and those seeds were beginning to take root. Every small victory, every act of defiance, brought the captives closer to freedom. The human had no intention of letting Zorak keep control for much longer. The tension aboard the ship grew with each passing day. The captives were no longer the defeated, broken souls they had once been. There was a new energy among them, a quiet resolve that Zorak's guards couldn't quite place. The human's plan was working, and Zorak's crew, though still unaware of the full scope of what was happening, began to feel the effects of the mounting unrest. The ship was no longer the safe, controlled environment it had once been. Zorak's arrogance was his blind spot. He couldn't see that his operation was unraveling from within, that the very thing he had dismissed, the human, was the one pulling the strings. But the human wasn't done yet. There was still more to do, more to prepare. The final act of rebellion was approaching, but it had to be timed perfectly. One wrong move could bring the whole plan crashing down. But the human wasn't worried. He had faced worse odds before, and he knew how to play the long game. His patience, his quiet defiance, had brought him this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. The time for patience had passed. The human knew the moment was near. Everything had been building to this. The acts of sabotage had weakened the ship's systems enough that the crew, while still unaware of the scale of the rebellion, was on edge. It was time to strike. The plan was ready, the captives were ready, and now it was a matter of execution. The human initiated the next phase with precision. One by one, the prisoners fell into their roles, each tasked with a specific objective. The ship's power supply, already strained by the humans' earlier sabotage, was their first target. A handful of captives, those trusted with the most delicate tasks, worked in the shadows to overload the generators. It wasn't a full system collapse, yet, but it was enough to trigger alarms and send Zorak's crew scrambling to fix the problem. Chaos was beginning to brew, and the human made sure it would only escalate from here. As the alarms blared, the guards rushed to contain the situation, leaving their posts in a panicked frenzy. This was exactly what the human had anticipated. He'd spent weeks memorizing their routines, noting the weaknesses in their defenses. Now, with the guards distracted, the human led a group of captives toward the control center. Every move was calculated, every step part of the larger plan. The human didn't need weapons to gain control. He had knowledge, and that was far more dangerous than any weapon Zorak's crew possessed. He knew how the ship's systems worked, how to manipulate the locks, how to override the commands. As the group reached the control center, the human quickly disabled the security protocols, locking Zorak's guards out and ensuring that the captives now held the upper hand. Panic spread among the crew as they realized the ship was no longer under their control. Zorak, who had been lounging in his quarters, was jolted into action by the alarms. At first, he dismissed it as another technical malfunction, but the frantic calls from his crew made it clear this was something far worse. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't possible. He'd been so sure that everything was under control. But as more reports flooded in, systems failing, prisoners missing, guards overwhelmed, Zorak began to understand. The human. Gravik had warned him. And now, it was too late. Zorak's arrogance had blinded him to the truth, and now the rebellion was unfolding in front of him. The human had already taken control of the ship's core systems, and with the help of the other captives, they began shutting down sections of the ship, isolating the guards and cutting off their communications. Zorak's empire, the one he had built with such confidence, was collapsing from within. Meanwhile, in the heart of the ship, the human stood at the center of the control room, directing the next steps of the uprising. His calm demeanor never wavered, even as the situation escalated around him. His focus was absolute. The captives looked to him for guidance, trusting him completely. He had earned their respect, not through grand speeches or empty promises, but through action, through careful planning, through his unwavering resolve. The ship's defenses were falling apart, and Zorak knew it. Desperate, he gathered his remaining loyal guards and attempted to retake the control room by force. But the human was ready for this. As Zorak and his men stormed the corridors, they encountered trap after trap. Doors sealed behind them, cutting off their retreat. Power surges short-circuited their weapons, leaving them vulnerable. And all the while, the humans' allies continued their assault, targeting critical systems and weakening Zorak's grip on the ship. In the chaos, Zorak's confidence shattered. He had underestimated the human, just as Gravik had warned, and now he was paying the price. But Zorak wasn't one to go down quietly. He still had one final move to make. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Zorak activated the ship's emergency override, a system designed to shut down all internal functions in the event of a mutiny. It was a desperate measure, one that would cripple the ship and potentially kill everyone on board. But once again, the human was ahead of him. The override system had been one of the first things he'd sabotaged. As Zorak slammed his fist against the control panel, expecting the ship to fall into lockdown, nothing happened. The human had already disabled the system, rendering Zorak's final play useless. Zorak's frustration boiled over into rage. How had this human, this insignificant creature, managed to outsmart him at every turn? It wasn't possible. But as Zorak stared at the blank control panel, the truth became undeniable. He had lost. Back in the control room, the human gave the final command. The prisoners, now fully in control of the ship, subdued the last of Zorak's guards. The rebellion was complete. What had started as a single act of defiance had turned into a full-scale uprising, and the human had led them to victory without firing a single shot. As Zorak's forces crumbled around him, the human made his way to Zorak's quarters. The door slid open, and Zorak, now alone and defeated, looked up in disbelief. For the first time, Zorak saw the human not as a slave, not as a weak, inferior being, but as something far more dangerous. A leader. A warrior. A force that could not be broken. The human didn't gloat. There were no words of triumph, no need for speeches. His victory was evident in the silence that filled the room. He had won, not through brute strength, but through cunning, patience, and unbreakable will. Zorak, once so sure of his power, now understood the full weight of Gravik's warning. He had taken a human as his slave. And now, he was paying the price. Zorak sat in silence, defeated. The hum of the ship's failing systems and the distant murmur of the freed prisoners were the only sounds that filled the air now. He had been so certain, so sure of his control. Now, that illusion was shattered. The human stood before him, silent and composed, no longer a prisoner but the undisputed leader of the rebellion. There was no need for threats or violence. The human had already won, and Zorak knew it. His empire was crumbling, and his arrogance had led him here, to this moment of ultimate humiliation. He had underestimated the one species that should never be underestimated. Gravik's warning echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of his own short-sightedness. He had taken a human as his slave, thinking them weak and easy to control. Now, that very human stood before him, having dismantled everything Zorak had built. In the hours that followed, the ship's corridors echoed with the sounds of freedom. The captives, once shackled and silenced, moved through the ship with a sense of newfound purpose. They had been mere cargo in Zorak's eyes, but now, they were something far more dangerous, free beings with a leader who had shown them the power of resistance. The human didn't need to direct them any longer. They knew what needed to be done. Zorak's guards were rounded up, disarmed, and imprisoned, their weapons useless against the tide of rebellion that had overtaken the ship. As for Zorak, the human didn't bother with revenge. There was no satisfaction in cruelty or petty retribution. Instead, Zorak was forced to witness the collapse of his empire firsthand. The human left him in his quarters, guarded but untouched, while the captives took control of the ship's systems and began broadcasting messages across the galaxy. The rebellion had spread far beyond the confines of Zorak's ship. Other slave ships, once thought to be invincible, now faced uprisings of their own. News of the human-led revolt traveled quickly, reaching distant corners of the galaxy. The idea that humans, so often disregarded and underestimated, could lead such an organized and decisive rebellion sent shockwaves through the alien trading networks. Those who had once profited from the sale of humans and other beings now feared what was coming. Their operations were no longer safe, their ships no longer impenetrable. The captives had hope now, and hope was more dangerous than any weapon. Gravik watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had seen it coming, even if Zorak hadn't. Humans, he knew, were not to be trifled with. They had a resilience, a stubbornness that made them dangerous when pushed too far. And now, the galaxy was learning that lesson the hard way. Gravik approached the human one last time, not as an enemy, but as a respectful observer of the events that had transpired. "You've done what many thought was impossible," Gravik said, his tone devoid of the condescension that had once been so common among Zorak's kind. The human said nothing in response, but the look in his eyes conveyed everything. This was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about survival, about freedom, and about showing the galaxy that no species, no matter how small or underestimated, could be enslaved forever. The ship, now fully under the control of the former captives, was transformed from a vessel of oppression into one of liberation. Systems that had once been used to track and control slaves were repurposed to aid in the resistance, to send messages of hope to others still in chains. The human's plan extended far beyond this one ship. He wasn't content with a single victory. This was only the beginning of a much larger movement. Across the galaxy, prisoners and captives of every species heard the call to rise up, to fight back, and to reclaim their freedom. Zorak's empire, once so vast and powerful, was crumbling with astonishing speed. His trading partners, once eager to do business, now distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with the downfall. The humans' rebellion had exposed the fragility of their entire system, a system built on the belief that certain species were superior, that humans were weak. But the galaxy now saw the truth: humans weren't weak. They were adaptable, resourceful, and most of all, they never gave up. The humans' victory reverberated across planets and systems. Governments and corporations that had once thrived on the exploitation of weaker species were now forced to rethink their strategies. Zorak, once a symbol of power and control, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance and underestimation were dangerous weaknesses. As the days passed, the human and his allies worked to secure their newfound freedom. They dismantled Zorak's operations piece by piece, freeing other captives and ensuring that no one would fall back into chains. The human's leadership was unquestioned, not because he sought power or recognition, but because he had earned it through action and sacrifice. He had shown what was possible, and now, others followed his example. Zorak, once proud and boastful, now sat alone in his quarters, a shadow of the figure he had once been. He had lost everything, and the worst part was, he knew it was his own doing. His arrogance had blinded him to the threat that had been right in front of him all along. Gravik's warning had been clear, but Zorak had ignored it, convinced that he knew better. Now, he was nothing more than a symbol of failure, a reminder to others that humans could not be controlled, that they could not be broken. The galaxy had changed. The rebellion had started small, but it had grown into something far greater. The human, though still silent, had become a beacon of hope for those who had been oppressed for too long. His actions had sparked a movement that would continue to spread, reshaping the balance of power in the universe. In the end, the human's legacy wasn't just about freeing the captives aboard Zorak's ship. It was about something much larger, a reminder to the galaxy that no species, no matter how small or underestimated, should ever be taken for granted. The human had shown them all that strength didn't come from physical power alone. It came from will, from resilience, and from the refusal to give up, no matter the odds. And that, Zorak now understood, was the true danger of underestimating a human.